Deinosuchus is already one of the biggest creatures in Jurassic World Evolution 3, but I wanted to make him look even bigger. So instead of changing the dinosaur, I decided to change everything around him. I'm going to build the smallest habitat I possibly can and see if I can make this prehistoric monster feel absolutely gigantic. Now that we know what we're trying to do, it's time to actually build this ridiculous habitat. The goal is pretty simple: make the enclosure as small as possible, while still making it look like somewhere Deinosuchus could actually live. And honestly, this is already harder than I expected. Usually when I'm building a habitat, I have the exact opposite problem. I have way too much space and I'm trying to figure out how to make it feel full. This time, I'm basically fighting myself to use as little space as possible. I started by carving out a small area for the water, because obviously this is going to be the most important part of the habitat. Deinosuchus was a semi-aquatic predator that lived during the late Cretaceous, roughly 80 to 73 million years ago, and its fossils have been found across North America. Smithsonian Magazine. And this thing was seriously massive. Estimates vary depending on the specimen and reconstruction, but some of the largest Deinosuchus are estimated to have reached around 8 to 10 meters long and weighed several tons. Nature! Which makes this challenge even funnier, because I'm basically trying to squeeze an animal that could reach the length of a bus into a tiny little enclosure. As I started adding the shoreline, I wanted to make sure the habitat didn't just look like a random square of water. So I'm adding different levels of terrain, rocks, and vegetation around the edges. Even though we're keeping the habitat tiny, these details should make it feel much more natural. I'm also trying to leave enough open space around Deinosuchus, because that's going to be really important for the final shots. If I cover the whole thing with trees and rocks, we might actually make him look smaller instead of bigger. And there's actually a pretty cool reason why Deinosuchus is such an interesting animal for this challenge. It wasn't just some giant crocodile sitting around eating fish. Fossil evidence shows tooth marks on dinosaur bones that are consistent with Deinosuchus feeding on them, although scientists can't always tell whether those animals were actively hunted or scavenged. Smithsonian Magazine? So imagine being a dinosaur millions of years ago, walking down to the water, and realizing that there's basically a 10-meter crocodilian waiting underneath the surface. That is exactly the kind of feeling I want this habitat to have. I don't want it to look like a normal zoo enclosure. I want it to feel like this tiny area somehow belongs to an absolutely ridiculous prehistoric predator. The final thing I'm focusing on here is scale. I'm deliberately putting some larger rocks and vegetation around the enclosure because when we finally release Deinosuchus, we'll have objects around him that give us an instant size reference. And the smaller this habitat gets, the more important those references become, because the dinosaur itself isn't changing at all. We're just changing everything around him. So after adding the last few details, I think we're finally ready to see whether this actually works. We've got the smallest habitat I could realistically build. We've got our giant prehistoric crocodilian waiting to go in. And now there's only one way to find out if Deinosuchus can actually look 100 times bigger. Alright, I've been working on this for a little while now, so I skipped ahead a bit and saved you from watching me place every single rock for the next 20 minutes. And as you can see, we've already made some pretty good progress. We've got the main water area starting to take shape, a bunch of rocks around the shoreline, and I'm slowly building up the terrain to make this tiny habitat feel much more natural. I'm trying to keep everything really compact here, because the whole point of this build is to make Deinosuchus look as massive as possible. So instead of giving him a huge open enclosure like I normally would, I'm basically squeezing everything into this much smaller space. The rocks are especially important because they'll give us some really good scale references later. When Deinosuchus is standing next to something that already looks huge, he's going to look even more ridiculous. I'm also leaving some open space around the water because I don't want the final habitat to become so crowded that we can't actually see the dinosaur. So we're definitely getting there. The basic shape is finally coming together, but there's still a lot of work left to do before we can release Deinosuchus and find out if this whole idea actually works. Now that the main structure of the habitat is done, it was time to focus on the part that can completely change how this place feels, the environment. I started by shaping the terrain around the water and adding different elevations, because I didn't want this to look like a perfectly flat little box. Even though the habitat is intentionally tiny, I still want it to feel like a real piece of prehistoric wilderness. Then I started adding rocks and vegetation around the edges. I'm trying to keep most of the larger objects around the outside while leaving the center relatively open. That way, when Deinosuchus finally goes in, we'll still have a clear view of him. For the trees, I'm going for a much denser look than I normally would. Since we're working with such a small space, a few carefully placed trees can make the habitat feel much deeper than it actually is. I'm also mixing different types of vegetation instead of just repeating the same plants everywhere. Little details like this might not seem important while you're building, but they make a huge difference once you see the entire habitat from a distance. And this is probably my favorite part of building habitats in JWE3, taking something that starts off looking completely empty and slowly turning it into an environment that actually feels alive. We're getting pretty close now. The habitat is still ridiculously small, but it's finally starting to look like somewhere a prehistoric predator could actually live. All that's missing now is the biggest part of the entire experiment, Deinosuchus himself. And here we are, the finished Deinosuchus habitat. We started with one simple idea. What if we didn't make Deinosuchus bigger, but instead made everything around him smaller? And honestly, I think the final result actually works. The habitat is tiny compared to the ones I normally build, but with the water, rocks, terrain, and vegetation all packed into such a small space, Deinosuchus completely dominates the enclosure. And that's exactly what I wanted. He doesn't just look like a giant crocodilian anymore. He actually feels like the entire habitat was built around this massive prehistoric monster. So, did we actually make Deinosuchus look 100 times bigger? Obviously, his actual size hasn't changed, but looking at these shots, I think we definitely managed to make him feel a whole lot more massive. But now I want to know what you guys think. Would you actually keep Deinosuchus in a habitat this small, or would you give him a huge open swamp instead? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the build, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more Jurassic World Evolution 3 builds. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.